Tonight, the nuclear freeze. Senator Edward Kennedy debates Senator Gordon Humphrey. Chronicle, a special edition, July 7th, 1982. Live from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Donna Downs, and welcome to this special edition of Chronicle. For the next hour, Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts and Republican Senator Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire will debate the nuclear freeze issue. To begin with, the senators will present opening statements. Next, they will address key issues of a nuclear freeze. And thirdly, they will answer questions put to them by the audience that is gathered here with us tonight. Jean?
Tonight, people are thinking the unthinkable, that a nuclear war is possible, and the call is going out to stop, to freeze the nuclear weapons right where they are before that thought is as controversial as any issue this country has faced in recent years. And now we're going to Chet Curtis on the floor for tonight's debate.
Thank you, Jean, and good evening. Seldom has there been such an outpouring of sentiment over a single issue. Millions of Americans are calling for a nuclear freeze. Senator Edward Kennedy has called for an American and Soviet freeze on nuclear weapons. Together with Senator Hatfield, he has co-sponsored a bill that would require a mutual and verifiable freeze on the testing, production, and further deployment of nuclear warheads, missiles, and other delivery systems. That bill is headed for the floor of the Congress for debate, and the question will be on the ballot in many states during the November election. Senator Gordon Humphrey, a Republican, opposes the freeze and supports a strong defense program. He favors eventual disarmament, but fears that a freeze could be dangerous now. We will begin, and let me just go over the format briefly, with opening statements from both senators, and by virtue of a coin toss prior to this broadcast, Senator Humphrey has elected to make the opening statement. Senator Humphrey.
Thank you, Chet, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let us begin, at least begin, by agreeing on certain values. No person wants his family or her family to be destroyed by a nuclear bomb. Nobody wants nuclear war. Indeed, almost everyone wants to reduce substantially the stockpiles of nuclear weapons on both sides. You do, I do, Senator Kennedy does, President Reagan does. The question is, how do we get from where we are to where we want to go? That's the issue. That's the issue under debate. President Reagan's approach is to engage the Soviets in the strategic arms reduction talks, which have just begun in Geneva. And as an opener, the President has proposed that both sides reduce their nuclear arsenal, that is warheads and bombs, by a third. That's a very substantial reduction, yet one which is quite achievable. The freeze approach, on the other hand, would put the United States into a straitjacket just at the very time that we are beginning a long-delayed and long overdue and badly needed modernization of our strategic delivery systems. Now, what does that mean? It means, for instance, a freeze would block the replacement of the now ancient B-52 bomber with the B-1, by the B-1. It would mean that we would be blocked from replacing some of our older missiles. Now some of them so decrepit they are literally blowing up in their silos, would block us from replacing those. So put yourself in the shoes of a Soviet negotiator. If the United States is willing up front to put itself in a straitjacket and forego all of its best options, then what incentive is there later on down the road for the Soviets to negotiate the kind of reductions that we all desire? The freeze is a dead end. It won't work.
All right, Senator Humphrey. Now an opening statement from Senator Kennedy.
Thank you very much. The issue that we are talking about this evening is really the most important issue of our time. It really reaches the question of survivability, not only for the people of the United States and the Soviet Union, but all the world. When we look at the massive power of both the Soviet Union and the United States, 1 million Hiroshima bombs, the equivalent of 4 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child that inhabits this planet. Recently, the Secretary of Defense, as well as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They were asked specifically, would you trade the nuclear capability of the United States for the Soviet nuclear capability? Both answered in the negative. they prefer the American nuclear capability. Then why not put in place a freeze now? We offer this resolution not because we trust the Soviet Union, but because we believe a freeze can be verified. And we offer this resolution not because we approve of all of the behavior of the Soviet Union, but we also believe that they also want to avoid nuclear confrontation and nuclear war. Just a few years ago, I had a chance to visit Hiroshima with my children. No words can describe the horror of that particular bomb explosion. Now we are all on ground zero. Here in Cambridge and in Boston, in Massachusetts, all across this nation. And time is calling upon us to act, and act now.
Thank you, gentlemen. Since Senator Humphrey had the first opening statement, Senator Kennedy will get the first question. Excuse me. We have a few questions during this first portion of the broadcast to sort of set the stage and identify the issue and where the two senators stand, and they'll clarify that even more as the hour goes on. In the second half hour of our broadcast, the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions. Senator Kennedy, Defense Secretary Weinberger, to whom you referred a moment ago, says that we must first arm to disarm, and he argues that we can't afford a freeze because the Soviets are so far ahead of us in the nuclear arms race, and he said that despite what he may have testified before the Foreign Relations Committee, to which you alluded a moment ago. He argues that a freeze now would lock us into a weak position. Isn't that a legitimate fear?
First of all, we ought to understand what the facts are with regards to the nuclear arsenal of the United States and the Soviet Union. We have 9,000 nuclear warheads. They have 7,000 nuclear warheads. We're ahead in some areas. The Soviet Union is ahead in some other areas. No one questions the fact that if the Soviet Union should have a successful first strike on the United States, we could land on the Soviet Union some 3,500 nuclear warheads, the smallest of which are the equivalent of 3 Hiroshimas, in which over 300,000 people died. Those happen to be the facts. The only question is how high the rubble would bounce after the United States would land that number of nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. And I dare say it would bounce all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok. Those happen to be the facts. When Secretary Weinberger and the Joint Chiefs of Staff appeared before the Foreign Relations Committee, as I mentioned earlier, they were asked specifically whether they would trade the nuclear capability of U.S. for USSR. The answer is no. If the answer is no to that, then why not put in place a freeze and then work for reductions?
All right, Senator Humphrey, you have said that our own nuclear arsenal is a deterrent to nuclear war. The Soviet Union will not use its weapons because they're afraid that we'll use ours. This attitude has led to a nuclear buildup that seems to have no limit. If we don't freeze, don't we ensure a continuation of the arms race?
Well, I'm all for arms reductions. I think almost everyone is, but the method by which we proceed is very important. As you pointed out, I stated earlier that the purpose of our strategic arsenal is to deter the Soviets from using theirs, and it has for 30 years, 30, 35 years. The credibility of the deterrent is all important. If it's not a credible deterrent, if the credibility is declining, as ours is because of the age of the B-52 bombers, the old Titan missiles that are blowing up, the submarines that don't have the missile range that they need. If the credibility is declining, then you're moving towards a situation of instability, and that's what we want to avoid. So the President is proposing not an arms buildup. We're not proposing higher levels of arms. We're proposing to modernize the strategic delivery vehicles. That's an important point. A lot of people have the impression that we're going to stack bombers on top of bombers and ICBMs on top of ICBMs. What the President wants to do is to modernize the bombers, the ICBMs, the submarines. Not to raise the totals, but to modernize them, to make them more credible as a deterrent.
Senator, I want to give you an opportunity to rebut the answer that Senator Kennedy just gave. He made the point twice in his opening statement and then an answer to his first question. Just take that one issue, for example, that Defense Secretary Weinberger and the Joint Chiefs in an appearance before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said they wouldn't trade our nuclear capability for the Soviets. Doesn't that say something about where we stand?
Well, what would it say if they said yes? Of course they're going to make a statement like that. They would be dismissed the next day by the president if they said otherwise. We would, you know, if you're going to come down to trading weapons, the Soviets have the most accurate and powerful ICBM in the world. Of course our Joint Chiefs would like to have that, but they're not going to say it. That's beside the point. What we want to do is reestablish the credibility of our deterrent on the one hand while simultaneously negotiating with the Russians for reductions. And that's the course of action that President Reagan has undertaken.
Well, the president himself has said that, as a matter of fact, I think if memory serves, he's the first president to concede that the Soviet Union does have superiority. Yes. At this point.
Well, I believe that the Soviets are superior, but that's a question you can argue all night. But in any case, it's the wrong question. The question we should ask is our deterrent a credible deterrent, and what are the trends? And the trends are adverse, and that's what we want to correct while simultaneously negotiating arms reductions. If the Soviets are genuinely interested, they have a means of stopping our modernization by agreeing to a substantial reduction.
All right, Senator Kennedy, doesn't all this talk about a nuclear freeze, the demonstration in New York, hundreds of thousands of people, the debate in the halls of Congress, and the votes in various cities and towns and states across these United States give the Soviet Union a picture of a house divided? Doesn't that work to their advantage now to see us arguing and debating whether or not we ought to freeze the nuclear weapons buildup?
Before I respond to that question, on the issue about the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, there shouldn't be any question about what the facts are. The United States is ahead in the triad. We have a more effective submarine force than the Soviet Union, a more effective air force than the Soviet Union. And the members of the Congress, the Senate of the United States, understand that. What the administration is proposing is build more now, today, so we can reduce tomorrow, so then we can freeze. That makes no common sense, and this is what I label as voodoo arms control. The opponents of the freeze might say that they're only modernizing. Look at the budget. The request for the MX missile, the request for funding for stealth, request for the Trident II, request for the B-1 bombers. Those are highly sophisticated weapon systems. And is there anyone in this audience or watching this program that's going to doubt that the Soviet Union is going to match us missile for missile, bomber for bomber over the period of the next years, while the United States spends $100 billion towards building these new weapon systems? Of course they're going to do that. And that's basic to this question that we talked about earlier. Now, in response to the other question that you raised, of course there's debate and discussion in the United States. That's part of a democracy. And I find that a strength for the United States of America. But I personally believe that we can have negotiators that sit down with the Soviet Union at the bargaining table and bargain as hardly and with the interest of the United States national security in mind as the Soviet Union can.
All right, Senator
I don't
Kennedy,
find that a weakness. I find that a strength.
We are about to take a break, but I do want to give Senator Humphrey an opportunity to rebut your last remarks.
Well, notwithstanding what my friend and colleague, Senator Kennedy, just said, in fact, we are proposing to modernize, not increase. The B-52 bomber is going to fall out of the sky whether we like it or not. They're just not a credible penetrating bomber anymore. They won't be much longer. We're proposing to modernize those with newer bombers. Likewise, missiles. So the thrust is modernization, not a build-up. That's a misapplication of a label. It's a common false perception, but it's just that.
All right, thank you very much. We will take a short break here, and when we come back, we'll have more of the debate on the nuclear freeze. Stay with us.
This month on Health Beat, cataract surgery that restores sight in minutes. An instrument that lets doctors actually see the brain at work. It
It receives and records the photons as they shoot out of the brain.
And a program for high-risk teenagers.
I've tried 3 or 4 times to kill myself.
I'm Dr. Timothy Johnson. Please join me for this edition of Health Beat.
Wednesday, 8:30 on 5.
Hi, I'm Dan Kane. Do you ever wonder what you're missing when you go to bed? Well, here at 5 All Night, we'll show you the other side of daytime. We've got the latest in comedy.
The Gerald Ford juggle.
We've got the latest in music. And the latest in yo-yos. Hey! Join us now at our new time, Monday through Friday at midnight. 5 All Night. It's the latest show in town.
Welcome back to our special edition of Chronicle. We're here live at the Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, which is just packed to the rafters of people who are interested in the nuclear freeze issue. Now, we're in the midst of a debate on that issue between New England Senators Gordon Humphrey and Edward Kennedy. A nuclear freeze has been called the issue of the 80s. And as you can tell by our turnout here tonight, there are a lot of people who feel very strongly about that issue. No exception to that is Mr. Ted Temple, who's with me here now. Mr. Temple is the leader of the Mid-American Conservative Political Action Committee. Mr. Temple, before we return to the debate, let me ask you one quick question. Polls that we read suggest that 75% of the American population is in favor of a nuclear freeze, and yet you oppose. Does that mean that you feel that the American public is largely misinformed?
Well, I want to state something, that a New York poll asked the American people about the freeze, and 67% said they were for a freeze if it was equal in parity and if the Soviet Union was scaled down to equality with the United States, and 71% said that if there were on-site inspection, it was verifiable. I also want to mention that the press, and especially Senators Kennedy and Tsongas and the liberals, have been very reprehensible in not really pointing out some of the really critical things. The fact, Mr. Kennedy tonight has not addressed the fact that 50,000 Cambodians have been chemically gassed to death, along with Afghans and Vietnamese, 800 Mosquito Indians, and all they talk about is a nuclear bomb going off. What I say they have to address are Soviet intentions, and what the press has done has been there's been hysteria, there's been fear created about bombs going off. With the policies of Mr. Kennedy and Mrs. Caldecott, we will have a nuclear war with their particular policies.
I'm sorry to cut you off. The debate is about... You have some supporters here. To the floor with Chet Curtis and the Senators. Chet?
All right, thanks, Don. I don't want to stifle a display of emotion here. It is a very emotional issue after all, and there are strong feelings on both sides, but it only cuts into the limited time that we have. Senator Humphrey, you might want to respond to something that Ted Temple said, but I want to ask you also, what do you say to your constituents who fear that we're headed toward a nuclear holocaust if this arms race, if this buildup continues?
Well, I say to them that what counts is a balance, both sides deterring one another. And it's important to maintain that balance and a stability. It is instability, whether in conventional weapons or nuclear weapons, that leads to dangerous conditions. So we must continue pretty much on this two-track course, to negotiate with the Soviets, to try to reduce tensions, to try to reach genuine agreements with them. But until such time as we do, we must maintain that balance. We must maintain the credibility of that deterrent. And I deplore some of the emotionalism connected with this freeze drive. I think there has been an awful lot of resort to emotion, to scare tactics, and if we're to survive in this nuclear age, both to preserve the peace and our freedom, then we have to proceed rationally and logically, not emotionally and not in a frenzy.
All right, Senator Kennedy, we've heard a lot of talk. What we talk about really, I guess, the basic issue is one of fear. You support the freeze, and what do you say to your constituents who fear that if we unilaterally disarm, or if we do it, we can't really verify the Soviet Union living up to the freeze, that we're laying ourselves open to a Soviet threat?
I reject any thought or any suggestion that those that support a nuclear freeze are asking for unilateral action. We're not. We're asking for action by the Soviet Union and the United States that is subject to verification. The basic problem that I have with those that support the administration's proposal and those that support the Warner-Jackson proposal is that it's the same old arguments that are being used in the nuclear arms race. But by and large, those that are supporting that proposal are building the whole list of weapon systems which I mentioned earlier, and then reduce, are the ones that have been opposed to SALT II, to SALT I, to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, to the Anti-Test Ban Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and all the rest. What is essential now is if we have substantial equivalency with the Soviet Union, we can destroy them, they can destroy us many times over. What difference does it really make how many times that you're going to be able to be killed? And this is really the basic issue which any child understands. If you continue to put block on block on block on block, eventually those blocks come tumbling down. Any child understands that. That's been the history of the arms race over the period of the last 30 years. The idea of a freeze is a simple idea, but it's not simplistic. It understands that if you have an elevator that is going up in a building, then in order to make it to go down, you first of all have to stop it. That is what the freeze does. It says stop, then reduce.
All right, Senator, we're out of time for this portion of our discussion. The format also calls for each of you to have an opportunity to ask the other a question. And Senator Humphrey, you may ask the first question of Senator Kennedy.
All right, thank you, Chet. Just a moment ago, Senator Kennedy stated, or at least implied, that many of those, like me and some of you, who oppose the freeze for the reason, in our opinion, that it won't work, but who nevertheless oppose it, are also opponents of the disarmament process of SALT II, for instance, SALT I, and so on. So my question to Senator Kennedy is this. One gentleman high in the Carter administration, namely Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, who obviously is a strong supporter of the disarmament process and likewise SALT II, had this to say about the freeze proposal in an article published March 29th of this year. He said, among other things, said, its provisions are no solution to the problems of preventing nuclear warfare. He said also that the freeze proposal would divert attention from and erode unity behind more important steps. So there's a man who obviously supports the disarmament process, who helped certainly concretely to push SALT II, and yet he is opposed to the freeze. So I think your characterization is quite unfair. That's a statement, but you can respond.
Okay, I was going to say, would you want to ask a question or just have him respond to the
statement?
Yeah,
just respond. We're flexible.
The fact of the matter is, on this issue, I differ with Harold Brown, and I think that those that have supported the nuclear freeze movement, whether they're in New Hampshire or in Massachusetts across this nation, also take issue. What they understand is that the nuclear issue is too important to be left to the experts and really left to the elitists in government. It's something that affects families in our society. And something that the families cannot understand is that if we can destroy each other over and over again, does it make any sense to continue to add missile upon missile upon missile? And they are reaching the conclusion that it does not. This may be a new idea that has now developed from the grassroots. All right, but it's an idea, I think, that's time has come. It makes common sense, and it is sound arms control policy.
I want to give you an opportunity to ask a question of Senator
Humphrey. I'd ask Senator Humphrey that in the recent testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee, we found that in the answers of Secretary Weinberger and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Jones, said that they would not trade the nuclear capability of the United States for the nuclear capability of the Soviet Union. I'd ask you, don't you think that we can defend the United States today?
Yes. May I answer?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Most certainly, yes, but the trends are adverse. We cannot hobble along with these old weapons credibly much longer. We've deferred these modernization programs for 10 years.
Okay.
The point that I would say is Senator Humphrey has given the best argument that I could give tonight for the freeze. He said, yes, we can today, but the trends may be adverse to the United States. If that's the case, then why not put in place a freeze now and then move towards reduction?
All right, on that note, we will take a break, and when we come back, hold it, please, hold it. We're cutting into some valuable time. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, the two senators will entertain questions from the audience. Now, we do have an overflow crowd here. It's very warm. I would ask everyone here in the audience at the Kennedy School at Harvard to keep the questions brief. No speeches, please. We can cover a lot more ground. So stay with us. We'll be right back to take questions from the audience after this.
Yes, I'd be in favor of the freeze, because it's a beginning.
I think we have to be ready. I don't think we can trust them.
You know, there shouldn't be nuclear weapons because one bomb and everybody goes, you know what I'm saying?
Vote it in. Get rid of the nuclears. I've seen war. I've seen what it's done.
If they don't stop, I don't see how we can. We leave ourselves too vulnerable.
Well, my problem is, I hear one side of the view of the issue, and I'm for that side, and turn the channel to 5, and I'm on that side of the fence.
On News Center 5, you don't just watch the news, you experience the news. News Center 5 reporters average 12 and a half years experience each. They cover the news the way it should be covered, thoroughly, accurately, in depth, with an unrivaled understanding of the people and events of New England. Anyone can report the news. On News Center 5, you experience it. News Center 5, for the experience.
There's an important road in Massachusetts, a long and difficult road, and nobody wants to travel it alone. In fact, many people can't travel it at all without your help. They're cancer patients who need somebody to drive them to and from treatments. If you have a car and can spare a few hours each month, please call this number and volunteer to drive somebody along the road to recovery. There is a road. For many, there is a cure.
Well, New Englanders have really packed in here tonight, proving what a controversial issue this is. And with me right now is Dr. Helen Caldicott. She is the head of the Physicians for Social Responsibility and one of the front runners in forming the nuclear freeze in this country. Dr. Caldicott, we said earlier tonight that people are thinking the unthinkable, that they're afraid there will be a nuclear war. Do you think that the leaders in this country are planning for such a war?
Well, President Reagan's Soviet advisor, Richard Pipe, said recently that we have to start preparing ourselves psychologically for a nuclear war. And I think that we may have to, because these new weapons that Senator Kennedy is talking about are very specific. They want to build about 8,000 cruise missiles, which are unverifiable. And once they're deployed in Europe and in the submarines and the planes, that will be the end of arms control and SALT talks, strategic arms talks. The other thing they want to do is put Pershing II missiles in Europe, which reach Moscow in 6 minutes. That means Moscow will have to go to a system called launch on warning, where computers launch nuclear war within 6 minutes. When I learnt those two facts, that our world soon, within a year or two, could be controlled by a computer, and these cruise missiles are unverifiable, I had to give up practicing medicine. I couldn't see any point in keeping children alive anymore when maybe within the next 10 years they could be annihilated.
Thank you, Dr. Caldicott. We want to get back to the debate now. And now back to Chet Curtis and Senators Kennedy and Humphrey.
All right, Gene, and as I mentioned, the balance of this hour will be devoted to questions from the audience. And let's take the first one now. Go ahead, sir.
This question is directed towards both senators. What is the basis for your conclusion on whether or not the Soviets are trustworthy in this negotiation? Or from the Soviets' point of view, why the United States is trustworthy? And in particular, what are your sources of information?
Who wants to take it first? Go ahead, Senator Humphrey.
Well, the Soviets have proven pretty conclusively that they aren't trustworthy, and that's why we must have treaties that don't rely on trust. It's that simple. That's not easy, but I think it's achievable. That's why we keep trying.
Senator Kennedy?
Yeah. First of all, I believe that there can be verification. The issue of verification was gone into in great depth during the Senate's consideration of the SALT agreements. And there, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as Secretary Brown, testified that they could verify testing and deployment. I also attended the comprehensive test meetings that took place in Geneva between the United States and the Soviet Union as an observer for the United States Senate. And during those negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed, in principle, to on-site inspection on comprehensive test ban. Now, the fact is that in the hearings that we have had before the United States Senate, we have had the former head of the CIA, Mr. Colby. We've had the former Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, who have testified that a freeze can be verified.
All right,
and frankly, a final point, frankly, the administration's own proposal implies that there will be verification. Their proposal is build more, then reduce, then freeze. They've stolen the word of the freeze movement by talking about freeze. So they themselves must agree implicitly that verification is possible.
In terms of the source of information, does the source of information go beyond the government or the military? Is there any source of information that you have from the Soviet Union, from citizens of the Soviet Union, from the medical community, from the education community, and what would those sources be?
Well, unfortunately, as you know, the Soviet citizens count very little in the councils of government in Moscow, and that's the problem. If the Soviet citizens could have their way, we would have no problem. As one of the Russian dissidents here would agree. Have your question, please? Yes. But we're not dealing with Soviet citizens. We're dealing with an unelected elite outfit which resort to any kind of gangster tactics to keep themselves in power. So that's another problem.
If the satellites can read the license plates on Soviet cars traveling in Moscow, I think we ought to be able to detect nuclear explosions and deployment of nuclear weapons. I'm
let's
not
take another
prepared
question. But let me just interject quickly. The satellites cannot read the license plate of Soviet automobiles parked in garages. Likewise, weapons.
Hold on. Senator Humphrey, the bulletin...
I didn't know they fired missiles from the garage.
But we digress, Senator. Hold on. Go ahead.
Senator Humphrey, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists maintains a clock. Today, after Afghanistan, the demise of détente, and the recent U.S. military buildup, the clock is at 8 minutes to midnight. How will increasing the level of animosity between the U.S. and the USSR by extending the nuclear arms race help to set the clock back and give us all a little more time?
Well, what we want to do, and what we've been trying to do for years, is to maintain a balance, maintain stability, so that neither side will be tempted to a rash act by some gradual steps. That's what it's all about, maintaining a balance. All this talk about being on the verge of nuclear warfare, in my opinion, is a lot of rhetoric to scare the people of the United States half to death, and it's succeeded, if that's any consolation to the peace movement, so-called. That's unfortunate. We ought to be rational about this, thoughtful, not panicked, not emotional. And the question you just asked me, which was a loaded question, appeals to emotion. Let's be logical. We're in an intellectual institution here. Let's be logical.
Okay, next question, please. Go ahead.
I get a chance to comment? Do I comment on
You will in the next one. Go ahead.
My question's for Senator Humphrey. When it's almost universally agreed that a nuclear exchange could lead to a Holocaust, why is it that people opposed to freezing production and deployment before we have weapons that can't be verified, before we have weapons that invite first strike, insist upon linking a freeze to Soviet behavior in matters that don't threaten the very life of the Earth?
Well, as you know, we've engaged the Soviets in Geneva in START talks, as well as theater nuclear talks that began last November. And so, in effect, the Afghanistan problem has been put aside, the bullying of Poland likewise. So I think the administration is doing what you apparently want.
Senator, we got a little out of order here, and this question was going to be to Senator Kennedy. Let me give you a chance to respond, Senator, to the question before, and then we'll take one.
2 points that was implicit in the question, and I think are entirely accurate. First of all, the scare talk that we have heard have not been by the American people. They've been by the high government officials that have talked about a limited nuclear war and the ability for this country to win a limited nuclear war. When there can be no such a possibility. and by administration officials who've talked about exploding a nuclear weapon at a time of crisis over Central Europe. That kind of rhetoric and those kinds of statements are not being made out in the grassroots of this country. They've been made by administration officials in high places of responsibility. The second point, it's important to note, as Secretary of Haig pointed out in the Foreign Relations Committee, that it's usually during the negotiations that there is the most dramatic buildup of the arms race on each side. Both nations trying to gather the extra bargaining chips in order to give them away when they finally reach a final negotiation. That is the testimony of Secretary Haig. The problem, additional problem with the Warner-Jackson proposal is that you would have a prolonged negotiation with each nation building up and modernizing it in its system, and with all the destabilizing factors that can be included, new weapon systems that can invite a first strike.
All right, Senator,
what we're talking about is putting in place a freeze now and then reduce, not prolonged negotiations.
Okay. Another question? Do you have a question for who? Go ahead.
My question is addressed to Senator Kennedy, and I'm glad that we have been talking about the first
Gordon
strike
can take
capability.
it first if he wants to.
I'm sorry about that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I
Chet,
can
can
ask
we agree
Senator
on a
Humphrey,
2-minute
but,
rule or
Kennedy's
something
got to
here
answer
so
it,
I think we'll have to.
All right.
Senator Kennedy, probably you're aware of the fact that the Soviet Union can destroy most of our ICBMs on the ground with about 25% of their own ICBM force. And you're probably also aware of Richard Pearl's remark that the SS-20 missiles now deployed and targeted against NATO could strike all high-value targets with only half of their supply of missiles. Long have you been an advocate of or opposer of first strike capability in the United States? Now the Soviet Union has first strike capabilities in two indisputable cases. I would like to know why you accept the Soviet first strike capability in your presumption of parity. Why are you suddenly silent on this issue when the Soviet Union has this capability in their hands?
Okay, Senator, I hope the answer is just a little
for the very reason, yes, for the very reason that we only have 25% of our nuclear capability on land. So even if the Soviet Union had a successful strike against the United States and destroyed all of our ICBMs, we'd still have the 3,500 that would be able to end and extinguish life in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
That's the answer.
All right, next question.
Senator Humphrey, I'm with the Council for Nuclear Weapons Freeze in Cambridge. Since in national and local matters where people are held hostage, nonviolent and conciliatory approaches are used, why does our government in the international arena, where millions are held hostage, each to the other, why does our government there use a confrontational approach, such as the recently published Pentagon 5-year plan of economic, political, and possibly nuclear warfare against the Soviet Union on the very eve of nuclear arms negotiation?
I don't know that that was published. I'll assume that your information is correct.
It's in the Times.
And I can't answer the question. But look, how much more evidence do you need that this administration is proceeding on good faith than the fact that since last November, after only 10 months in office, President Reagan began negotiations on nuclear weapons in Europe and offered to forego completely, 100%, the deployment of the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missiles if the Soviets would disassemble those 325 SS-20s that they have constructed in the last 2 years. How much more evidence do you need than the fact that our bargainers are in Geneva right now and that the President has offered to reduce stockpiles 1/3 on both sides and that will consider in good faith any Soviet offer, and to reduce the numbers of ICBMs? Look about you. How much more evidence do you need?
All right, Senator Humphrey, let's take another question over here.
My question is addressed to Senator Humphrey. It's evident tonight that one of our questions is international credibility, how we look to the Russians, how they look to us. This is not confined to ICBMs and submarine ballistic missiles. I have a question on that basis. The nuclear freeze campaign calls for limiting defense spending. On the presumption that we will defend Europe, would not the dollar cost be greater if we massed great numbers of troops in Europe to counter the Warsaw Pact armies rather than use tactical weapons for that purpose? And would our troops have credibility?
Well, of course, the advent of theater weapons, nuclear weapons in Europe, arose out of the circumstances that the Soviets have this huge advantage in, first of all, geographic location, proximity, but also in troops and firepower, in all the conventional categories, virtually. And so your question can be answered this way. Yes, of course, if we could begin to match the Soviets in conventional terms, then we wouldn't have to be dependent upon the threat of theater nuclear weapons to deter a Soviet attack. All the Soviets have to do to prevent the outbreak of war in Europe, to prevent the use of either conventional or nuclear weapons, is to stay within their own borders. Is that asking too much?
All right, Senator Humphrey, on that note, we'll take a brief break from the debate. Let's go to Jean Blake.
The nuclear freeze and nuclear war provoke all kinds of opinions from people in our society, and recently a local group of artists got together to reflect on the issue, and we'd like to share their reaction with you now.
Who were the Puritans? Were they a drab, repressed people? Find out how sophisticated and lively our country's ancestors were by visiting New England Begins, the 17th century, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Experience a 17th century house raising, see crafts of the period in action, and discover over 500 treasures from the lives of the people who built our country. New England Begins, through August 22nd at the Museum of Fine Arts.
Every day we hear about another violent crime in our neighborhoods, and we say to ourselves, well, that's too bad, but it can't happen to me. But if it did happen to you, what would you do? On our next edition of Good Day, we'll hear what happened to one man, what he did. Plus, we'll get some advice as to what you would do, or can do, if a man comes up to you and pulls a gun or a knife. Join us, won't you? Eileen Froese, Jim Caldwell, and me, John Willis, for Good Day.
We're back live at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University for a debate on the nuclear freeze with Senator Gordon Humphrey and Senator Edward Kennedy. We will resume with a question for Senator Kennedy, and I would urge the questioners once again to keep the questions as brief as possible, and we'll try to balance both sides here. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Kennedy, in light of the fact that in the last election, 72% of the people of Boston voted for a referendum that requested Congress to shift money away from the Pentagon and towards public education, public transportation, and energy conservation programs, what plans do you have to ensure that a nuclear freeze will reduce our military expenditures?
Just the cost of the figures that are being recommended by the administration in the range of different weapon systems that I outlined earlier. That is in the MX, the Trident II, the B-1 bomber, the Stealth bomber. The price tag on those weapon systems over the next 5 years is $100 billion.
All right, sir. Question for Senator Humphrey.
Yes, I'm with the Harvard International Review. Senator Humphrey, it seems to me that each side in this debate has its own figures on the relative Soviet and American strengths. And I was wondering if you could answer why it seems to be so difficult to get consistent estimates of Soviet and American strengths, and whether it really matters after a certain level of mutually assured destruction is reached.
Well, of course, the reason it's difficult to get accurate numbers on Soviet weapon systems is that they don't share that information with us, unlike we, who share that information in order to promote arms negotiations. It's the balance. It's perceptions. You know, the war in the Falklands, why did that begin? Because there were weapons? No, because General Galtieri misperceived and miscalculated. And we want to be sure that we maintain an adequate deterrent capability in terms of credibility that the Soviets and anyone else do not misperceive our will and our ability to defend ourselves if attacked. Balance, that's what it's all about. But let me point out this, referring back to your question. Levels, we can have a balance at this level, Soviet and U.S., we can have it at this level, we can have it at this level. Ultimately, we can have it zero, I would like to think. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring down the levels. That's what these START talks are all about, the strategic arms reduction talks.
All right, Senator, thank you. A question for Senator Kennedy.
Yes, I have a question for Senator Kennedy. We already have a very good arms treaty, SALT II, pending before the Senate. Wouldn't it be advisable to do first things first and do what we can to ratify that treaty, and then worry either about START or freeze after that?
First of all, if that measure were to come before the Senate today, I would vote in favor of it. But secondly, since the administration has taken such a strong position in opposition to it, I don't even think that it would get a majority of the votes, let alone two-thirds of the votes in the Senate. And that could be interpreted by the administration as a sufficient rejection that they would no longer observe the agreement itself, which they are observing now, with the exception of the development of new weapon systems. The SALT II permits the development of new weapon systems. So I would vote for SALT if it came before the Senate, but I believe the freeze is preferable under any account, because what that is saying is we have substantial equivalents today, each can destroy each other, put in place a freeze, and forget the additional new weapon systems that are on the planning boards and that are being requested of the Congress and that are on the planning boards of the Soviet Union and being requested by the Supreme Soviet.
Right. Another question from the audience for Senator Humphrey. Go ahead, sir.
I have a question for Senator Kennedy.
Oh, okay.
I believe it is the policy of the United States, number one, to preserve the sovereignty of the United States and the free world, and just as important is to prevent nuclear war. And in that light, Senator Kennedy, if the USSR and other nuclear powers will not agree to a freeze with adequate inspection criteria, do you believe the United States should freeze, and why?
I would my position is that we ought to challenge the Soviet Union to a freeze. That is my position, and I would be hopeful that we could get a positive response.
You're not answering my question, really.
Is what? No, no. If the question is a unilateral declaration and the dismemberment of those weapon systems, the answer is no.
Okay.
Senator Humphrey, if nuclear instability leads to nuclear war, why has there been none during the last 30 years, during which the United States has been far ahead?
Well, because it's quite true. We had unquestioned superiority. We don't any longer. But it's a difference in motives. The United States was not inclined to use its nuclear superiority to attack the Soviets.
And why would the Russians be so inclined?
Well, just take the historical context. Look at Eastern Europe. What do you call that? It's invasion, it's occupation, it's subjugation, it's enslavement. There's plenty of evidence of what the nature of the Soviet Union is.
Mm-hmm. But would they be willing to die in a nuclear holocaust just because?
No, of course not. The first use of nuclear weapons, indeed all weapons, is political pressure, intimidation. They're designed not to be used, but to intimidate. Use is a second resort.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, Senator Humphrey, we who oppose the freeze believe that our nuclear arsenal is inferior to the Soviets. Indeed, it's for this reason that we believe the freeze would be a destabilizing influence. However, assuming for the moment that the movement was successful, that we were duped into a freeze, and that wouldn't our conventional balance then have to be redressed if the nuclear scenario were precluded, which the freeze movement purports to do? And would it not then become necessary to support great sacrifices, probably including a draft and a nearly doubled conventional defense budget? And what other specific measures do you think would then have to be taken?
Well, it's clear that with regard to Europe, with regard to theater weapons, that we have to resort to the threat of their use to preclude and prevent any Soviet aggression. I would personally prefer to spend whatever it takes in unconventional weapons so that we didn't have to rely on that nuclear threat in Europe. But it would be enormously expensive, and the American people had better know about it. You're probably right. We couldn't get enough people to volunteer. We'd probably have to return to conscription. They'd really love that here at Harvard, I know.
All right, another question. Is this a question for Senator Kennedy? Okay, go ahead.
What will be the effect of a bilateral freeze on the peace movement in Europe?
Well, I think the reaction would be the same as for people all over the world, that at last the concerns of parents and people all over not only Europe but in the United States and in other parts of the world that recognize that the United States and the Soviet Union have enough nuclear capability to destroy life on this planet, we're finally acting responsibly and in the real interest of the future of humanity. That would be my reaction and my hope.
Thank you, Senator. Question for Senator Humphrey?
Actually, for Senator Kennedy.
Well, let's try to, I just try to get them alternating here so we can maintain a balance. Will you hold on just a minute? Do you have a question for Senator Humphrey? Okay, go ahead.
Senator Humphrey, I understand that in Switzerland, they have put many bomb shelters and things like that. How useful do you think that is for that country? And how useful do you think that is for this country in light of the fact that we'll have to put in billions and billions of dollars?
Well, you're referring to civil defense, of course, and I am not a great enthusiast about any massive civil defense measures. I think it's far better to prevent the outbreak of conflict and war in the first place. And how do you do that? By making sure that you project an image of capability and will so that no one miscalculates and misperceives. That's how wars begin.
All right, a question for Senator Kennedy. Go ahead, sir. Thank you for waiting.
Senator Kennedy, you have called Mr. Reagan's assertion that we must bargain with the Soviets from a position of strength repeatedly voodoo arms control. But isn't any other approach to arms control voodoo? The Soviets wouldn't bargain with us on anti-ballistic missile systems until we appropriated money to build our own. Would Neville Chamberlain have made Hitler less hungry by putting pre-war England on a stricter arms diet? Or to use your new metaphor, would Neville Chamberlain going down in his elevator stop Hitler from going up in his elevator?
What specifically is the question? What is specifically about Neville Chamberlain, or what is specifically
You've derided generally the notion that building weapons to force the Soviets to bargain is a legitimate position, saying that it's some kind of voodoo, and I'm saying that the Soviets have only negotiated with us in the past when we've negotiated from a position of strength. So that, as with the ABM system, by building systems sometimes enables us to reach a treaty.
Okay. Well, the fact of the matter is the Soviet Union has been willing to make an agreement with the United States when they have perceived that it's been in their self-interest. I think nations operate out of national self-interest. They were prepared to make the Strategic Arms Agreement in the early 1960s because they believed that it was in their self-interest. They did the same thing on the ABM SALT I and also SALT II. Now the question is whether we at this time have a sufficient kind of strength to destroy the Soviet Union and all life in the Soviet Union. I answer that in the affirmative. When we know that 90 missiles from one submarine can effectively destroy the 90 cities of 100,000 people or more in the Soviet Union, and we can rain 3,500 missiles on the Soviet Union, the smallest of which are 3 Hiroshimas, that is strength. How many times over do you have to kill this member of the Soviet Union to convince them that we are strong? We are strong, and what we don't need are members of the administration or others trying to decline or say that that strength does not exist. We have the ability to destroy them. They have the ability to destroy us. We have substantial equivalence. Why not stop the madness of continued escalation of the arms race, which Senator, has been the action of the past?
I'm sorry, we have a little less than a minute for this segment. Please, hold on. I want to get one more question for Senator Humphrey.
This question is for Senator Humphrey. This question is for Senator Humphrey. We didn't really get an answer before when the question was asked. If neither the U.S. nor the USSR has been able to agree on parity for freeze in the last 25 years, why expect that there will be agreement with still more stockpiled weapons? And I'd like an answer this time, please.
And hold on to your pauses. We don't have much time.
Well, I never avoid a question. If I didn't answer it, I didn't understand it. The point is this. We all want to reduce nuclear weapons, right? What is the best way to do it? If up front you agree to forego all of your best options, the Soviets aren't going to give you reductions. They're not altruistic, they're not charitable, they're not philanthropic. As Senator Kennedy pointed out, they deal with you only when they perceive it to be in their interest.
Okay, I've got to interrupt. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back with closing statements from both Senators Humphrey and Kennedy.
Who is this man, and why is he being followed?
You know who this is.
Should I? Is he famous? Is he wanted?
I want to take him home with me.
I wouldn't do that. I'd think he's crazy.
I think he's just adorable.
Reverend Pounds, the Weight Saint, Sergeant Simmons, whatever you call him, there's no one quite like him. The Richard Simmons Show, weekdays, 11:30.
On Channel 5.
You didn't tell me that part.
It's okay, they know.
What would you do if your loved one suddenly became helpless as a baby?
She's in shadow, if you will. She's in the dark now.
It just doesn't come out as clearly as I want to say it.
I think somebody described it as a very long goodbye.
Join Dr. Tim Johnson for a sensitive look at senility and how to cope with it. Someone I Once Knew, an original Channel 5 production, Saturday night at 8.
I don't want to put my mother in a nursing home.
All right, we're back live, and it's time now for our closing statements. And by virtue of the coin toss at the beginning of this broadcast, Senator Humphrey will go first, and you have 45 seconds, sir. Go ahead.
45 seconds. That's hardly adequate. Let me say this. Again, reiterate, we are all for reducing the stockpiles of weaponry. The question, the issue, the point of disagreement is how best to do it. Now, if you up front pledge to the Soviets that you're willing to forego all of your options, and that's what a freeze is, the Soviets are not, why should they? Where is the incentive? They are not going to negotiate the reductions. Back in the early 70s, there was an effort by the United States to negotiate a treaty against anti-ballistic missile systems. Soviets weren't interested in such a treaty until we made it clear we were going to build it. The upshot is that today we have an ABM treaty. And that's the approach we have to take if we really want those reductions.
All right, thank you, Senator Humphrey. Senator Kennedy.
The members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense have testified that the United States can defend its own interest and the interest of its allies. I agree with that. I asked the question, what if we had put in a freeze 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Would our children and the future children be better off? I believe that they would be, and that is why I believe it is essential that we put in place a freeze now. One of the most distressing facts that I know is over the last 20 months, there have been 140 instances where there's been mechanical failures by our defenses, which indicated that there was going to be a Soviet strike. That was caught in time. I'm not prepared to see the future of our generations decided on a 25% microchip.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for being here tonight. Just a couple of thoughts. A couple of thoughts before we leave you tonight. Our ability to affect the future comes directly from our ability to do what we did here tonight, a free and open discussion of issues that are so meaningful and controversial and so sensitive and of great meaning to all of us. Albert Einstein once said that the unleashing of the power of the atomic bomb had changed everything. Everything except man's way of thinking about war. Let us hope he was wrong. I'm Chet Curtis. Good night.